Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. Tonight, we're going to be talking about betrayal and boundaries. And I realized as I went back and looked at the title after that I had said it, that it might have been misleading. So I just want to make this disclaimer before we start tonight about what we're not going to talk about. This is not a broadcast about intimacy betrayal in relationships. I actually have an episode on that, episode 441. So if that's something you're interested in, you can go to our YouTube channel or any podcast app, search for Evoke Therapy Programs Podcast or Finding You Podcast, and you can go to episode 441. So if that's what you were expecting, I realize the title might have been misleading. But what that really leads into is this idea that inherent, anytime somebody moves away from the status quo, anytime somebody improves their mental health, stretches themselves, grows and levels up to a new level of awareness or understanding, others in the family will experience and accuse them of some kind of betrayal. In family systems theory, family systems therapy, they call this betrayal a healthy betrayal. It is to turn your back on the old ways, the old thoughts, the old programming. I think I mentioned this the other night. The Academy Award winning movie Everything Everywhere All at Once talks about this, or it illuminates, it gives an illustration of this kind of betrayal. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't worry too much about spoilers because it's a pretty complex movie, and for a lot of us, it takes a couple of times to watch it. But part of what happened with the main character is that she turned away from her generational programming. And in an essence, she betrayed her family of origin, betrays her father in the process. But that's what happens to us as we grow. And the thing that pulls us back in, mom and dad, husband and wife, wife and wife, husband and husband, the thing that pulls us back in to our old patterns is the accusations that we're being selfish, that we're being crazy, that we're betraying them, that we don't care. And so part of tonight's broadcast really is about bolstering you as you make changes, really getting you prepared for that change back energy, change back to the way that things were, being able to discuss and identify what are your buttons. You know, we talk about how children push our buttons. Of course they do. They've been programmed by us. They've been programmed by us to recognize intuitively where we are undone, not quite finished and completed. What they accuse us of is the thing that we most don't want to be, that we haven't come to terms with about ourselves. So when I talk about boundaries, and there are, of course, dozens, if not more, examples on this broadcast where I talk about boundaries, it gets very complicated. My favorite quote about boundaries, in fact, I use this in one of the chapter epigraphs in the book Audacity to Be You, is from somebody that I found on social media, Prentice Hemphill. And where they say, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So part of what we recognize in our boundaries is if we are angry, if we are unhappy, if we are living a life with somebody in relationship to somebody that is causing us great pain, that we would complain about them and how they're treating us, that they're not treating us the way that we deserve to be treated, or the way that we treat them. Those are signals that we can listen to that often suggest that we need to create some more distance. You know, part of moving out for most people, not all cultures, not everybody, but for most people in this culture, moving out of your parents' house creates a dynamic where you're less angry and triggered by them. When we have somebody that we love and care about and they pass away, you'll have the experience, if you haven't already, where you start to remember the good things. In many cases, you ruminate on the good things, you think about the good things, because the distance is self-care. The distance is, I'm going to take primary responsibility for my well-being. This is the fundamental idea in attachment in parenting, child development. This is the fundamental idea where the parent realizes that their serenity, that their peace of mind, that their anger, that their anxiety, their sadness, their grief, and then the list goes on, is their responsibility, not the child's. And when we suggest or parent, and I've done it and I still slip into it, when we parent from a place where the child is led to believe that how I'm feeling, what's going on for me as their father, is their responsibility, that they caused it, it comes at a great cost to their authentic and real self, which gets sacrificed and shoved into the closet. And then they go out in the world, and because this is the model, this is the soup that they've been cooked in, the air that they've breathed, the water that they've swam in, it's all around them. It's unconscious, it's unspoken, it's implied. Sometimes it's actually explicit and implied, and in some cases, the more explicit it is, when you are guilted and shamed and made overtly to feel responsible for your parents' behavior, it's actually easier to get clear about that. But for most of us, it's more subtle than that. When they go out into the world, they interact with people who they assume are like the other people that they've interacted with. And they get into relationships where they don't feel empowered to take care of themselves, to set boundaries, to walk away, to say no, to assert their truth, to live according to their own joy. They do that in part because they've been programmed, hardwired to believe that what other people think about them is about them. Some of you, many of you, I assume, have read or heard of the book, The Four Agreements, where he discusses, and his language is very unique. He's a fantastic writer and storyteller. But he talks about not taking things personal as one of the agreements. The idea that he says is, if somebody hates you, it's not about you. If somebody loves you, it's not about you. If somebody hits you, it's not about you. It's this idea of differentiation, of individuation, of developing a separate and sovereign sense of self. It is the foundation for the book, The Audacity to Be You. Starting with in the first chapter, where after the introduction, where I get into it, where I talk about finding yourself, honoring yourself. And to everybody else, I get questions all the time from spouses, from children, from siblings, from parents, where they will say, is my significant other, my other in this equation, are they being selfish? They're just calling it boundaries. Or are they just being selfish? Are they using it to punish or weaponize me? The point is, or my response to that question is, it doesn't matter what they're doing with it. You frankly, I don't say this to people at the time, but you frankly can't recognize from the outside looking in what they're doing and where it's coming from. It's best if you respond to the boundary that they're setting, no matter where it comes from and where it originates, as a boundary. And people, when they start to set boundaries, when they start to embark on this path that we're talking about, of becoming a human person and learning how to love and relate to others, it often will look messy and reactive, and it'll look like the pendulum has swung too far. But that's part of the process. Harriet Lerner in The Dance of Anger, and I'll reference her several times tonight, she calls it the obnoxious phase. Many people go through that obnoxious phase. In fact, that's in many cases, that's what teenage rebellion and anger can often be about. It's about that separation, trying to navigate that separation, or what I call that second birth. Why are boundaries so hard for people to understand? It's because they're subjective, because it's personal, because only I know if I'm coming from a place of authenticity and courage, or if I'm coming from a place of vindictiveness or trying to punish you. It's an inside job. And there's no definition of a right boundary or a good boundary. Because the definition of a good or a right boundary is subjective to the person. It's personal to the person. I've said this recently. I may have shared it the other night. In our family, we have lots of therapy discussions because we have several people that are therapists. So we'll have these clinical discussions, these ideas. And sometimes we have these friendly debates in our family around a concept or a principle, but there's something that gets said in these discussion that essentially ends the discussion in a healthy and a positive way. When anybody arrives at a point in the discussion where they say, "This is what's good for me," or "This is what I feel good about," or "This is what I need." Everybody else in the family understands that that's the a clear signal of a boundary, of a stated truth about somebody. And there's really no good argument against that. People get to choose what they like, what they love, what they don't like. I'm not talking about boundaries in parenting like curfews and setting limits around screen time. That's not the kind of boundaries I'm talking about tonight. Those decisions come out of this deeper idea of boundaries, which is defining yourself, defining who you are, what you like, what you can tolerate, what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. This is the transformation from the old programming to from having to be right, having to be justified, and being allowed to be a person. People in recovery from codependency, which is a way of being that is um, mostly marked by having poor boundaries, unhealthy boundaries. When people are in recovery for that, when they're working on that, when they're growing in that area, they speak from a position of, this is what I need, this is what I'm okay with, this is what I'm comfortable with. And they say less things that sound like, this is what you need to do, or this is the message you need to receive, or this is the lesson that you need to learn, or this will be good for you. In a sense, in a spiritual sense, we don't really know, because sometimes what's going to be good for somebody else, because sometimes the lesson comes in the midst or around mistakes or setbacks or detours or sidetracks. But what we can get in touch with, and what I'm going to be talking about tonight and repeating myself a lot more times, when we get in touch with our needs, what we need, what gives us joy, gives us meaning and purpose and serenity. If we develop that relationship, that becomes a focus of recognizing and identifying and staying in relationship to that part of self. That becomes our new moral North Star for parenting. Like I said in The Audacity to Be You, the thesis of the book, you don't get to be right anymore, but you do get to be a self, which is so much better. There's no right way. There's no generic truth or universal truth when it comes to, if you have a child that's struggling with substance abuse and you ask me, what do I do? I don't give an answer, not because I'm employing a technique, because I'm really operating from a place of, I don't know. We have to talk about it more. We have to find out what you're trying to accomplish. We have to find out what your goals are. We have to find out where you're coming from. We have to unravel your triggers, your trauma responses. I am more and more convinced. I've thought this my entire life to some degree, but I'm more convinced and more in a personal way connected to this idea that our children, by and large, are going to be more advanced than us ethically, morally, are going to be more enlightened and aware. It's almost always that way. There are exceptions, and your and my child could be one of those exceptions. But by and large, the next generation improves on the previous generation. But you know what? You know what the older generation always thinks? The older generation always thinks that those young people are going crazy, that they're going off track, that they're becoming less moral, less aware, less conscious. But I see it. I see it in the world today. And I've said this for decades now as an adult. I want to be the first generation that doesn't think that the next generation is ruining the world. I think they're our great hope. That's a bit of a detour. Boundaries are personal, like I mentioned. Guilt and shame, those are the sentinels. The reason boundaries are so difficult to understand and so difficult to exercise is because healthy boundaries will inevitably cause the person setting them, exercising them, inevitably they will cause them shame or guilt or fear and anxiety or all of those. We have been programmed and led to believe, again, as children, that how our parents feel is our responsibility, that if they're proud of us or happy for us, those are indications of us doing something well or not. And it is simply just not the case. I read this quote last night off my phone, and I decided to actually put it on the slides. I love this quote because he says it so bluntly. As I said last night, I was even a little bit hesitant to repost it or to even share it here because it might be too hard for some people to hear, but it's the truth. Nate Postlewaite, I don't know who he is, but he's got a good quote. He said, "You are not responsible for your parents' emotions. You are not responsible for their reactions to boundaries you place. You are not responsible to make them understand you choosing a different life than they did. You are responsible to live in a way that helps you feel whole." That's true for us, and it's true for our children. And as they grow older and develop, the goal is for them to launch and to live their life. And I'll talk about how we can more likely ensure or encourage that we and they can stay connected to each other on this journey, because that gives me great joy and meaning as a father. And we'll talk about what kind of sensibility has to be employed. Boundaries are difficult because when the other person is present, I call it the gravitational field. We lose ourselves in the gravitational field. And the more sensitive our nervous systems are, the more we've been conditioned in a codependent way to not have clear psychological boundaries with people, the more apt we are to lose ourselves. Right? I have a phone call with a parent. Oh, I'm doing some coaching. I say this all the time. They get clear about something. They're clear. It came from them, their boundary, their decision. And it is not uncommon at all. In fact, it's more often than not. They leave and they get confused. They think that their memory is failing them. They get in the presence of the other person, or they leave the safety of my virtual office. And they'll come back and say, "I forgot what we talked about. I need language. I need things to say." And really what they're talking about is therapy is a safe place where you find yourself over and over again. And once you leave the office, the energy in the world, right? The influence of the world, of our children, of our spouse, of our siblings, of our family of origin start to press in upon us, and we lose ourselves like we did when we were young in the first place. And so therapy is a place we go back to, ideally over and over again, to be found, which is just the vehicle for the better part, which is we find ourselves. We get found first by somebody else, by an adequate therapist, and then we find ourselves. Jessica Benjamin, the great attachment theorist, wrote, "It's only when we are found by somebody else that we can find ourselves. We have the experience of, yes, aha, there I am." And then we have to leave the office and embrace against the cold and difficult and hard world, face our fears. But over time, what happens is with the new programming in therapy that we receive, the programming of being ourselves, really identifying who we are, what we need to feel safe and okay in this world. We repeat that enough and we start to carry around this new programming, this new dialogue, and we learn to do things scared. We learn to do things guilty. We learn to do things that cause us shame. Healthy change, healthy progress will inevitably cause feelings of shame and guilt, fear and anxiety, inevitably. And therapy doesn't completely remove those influences, those energies, those feelings, but it equips us with new programming and new ideas that we are able to do things scared, able to resist the gravitational field to some extent. Part of the reason that people also is because the equation changes. They get distracted by details. Yes, I told my daughter, or I told my son, here was the screen time limit, and then they brought this up. They brought up this counterpoint. Now that could be a valid counterpoint that somebody brings up in a certain situation. But if the boundary is internalized, we know how to navigate that shift in information, that 10% change in the equation that we had brought to our therapist earlier in our earlier discussions, where we had found ourselves and found our center. And so over time, when I'm working with people, it's not that you can't. This is not something you can just learn and then do. It's something that you have to expose yourself to. I was reading the book today by Rick Rubin on the creative act. He's this gentleman who all kinds of famous artists, musicians hire to help them when they feel stuck creatively. And Rick Rubin says, expose yourself to classic literature instead of the news. Get up close to paintings, to great works of art. Level up your taste. And I was thinking about that today. That's kind of what this is. The reason I do this, the reason we broadcast these, is to expose you, not to Brad Reedy's thinking, but to the thinking that I've learned through my therapy, that I've learned through my study. This new way of being, this new sensibility. And we're outcome focused. The hard part about showing up in the world authentically and telling the truth is you have to surrender control. And most of us are expecting, hoping, accustomed to controlling things. Just think about it. The simplest example is, if you tell somebody the truth about what you feel, think, want, don't want, you risk them getting upset, getting angry, abandoning you, breaking off the relationship, yelling at you. You risk them having their reaction. But we've been conditioned as children to take care of our parents, to tiptoe, to find out how to navigate fragile egos, which, by the way, we're the ones with the fragile egos now. Excuse me. We're the ones with the fragile egos now that our children are learning to navigate, right? It's full circle. Because of that programming, then, we're accustomed to doing that in life. And we get rewarded for it in business, in other walks of life. Being able to manage and control people and get outcomes is financially rewarded. But on the spiritual journey, we have to surrender. It is telling the truth is both an act of will and an act of surrender at the same time. We have to let go of the outcome. And to let go of the outcome, you have to know that you're going to be safe. I love the simple adage, the bird that stands on the edge of a limb of a tall tree doesn't feel safe because it trusts the limb. It feels safe because it trusts its wings. We're able to tell the truth. We're able to show up, to set boundaries, to say no, to say, I'm sorry, I can't, or I'm not willing to. When we know we're going to be okay, when we know that we are okay, when we have trust in our psychological, spiritual wings, as it were. We get stuck with boundaries. We get confused with boundaries because we want others to learn from them, to change, and to not challenge them or us. We have this fantasy, I think, most of us, that if we get healthier, other people are going to applaud us. No, it's not the way that it works. It will sound foreign and strange and odd and actually unhealthy to other people, and they will gravitate toward the status quo. I love this idea, this next idea. A boundary is not a wall. A boundary is a door. When someone sets a boundary, I would invite you to try not to think of it as them wanting you out of their life, but them telling you how to remain in relationship. This also helps me when I have to set a scary boundary with somebody. Tell somebody how I feel, say no in a certain situation. I'm not saying I don't want you in my life. I'm saying, if you want to stay in relationship with me, this is the line that I draw on this particular issue, or this is what I need. If they are disordered, if they are significantly less mentally healthy, they will resort to shaming and punishing and threatening and anger and debate, right? They'll go to those places because that's their programming too. And that's also how we've been programming. And the discussion, the dynamic can definitely regress. So what are boundaries? First of all, they're connected to a sense of self. Who are you? Meaning, what do you want? What do you don't? What do you don't want? What are your goals? What do you like? What do you prefer? Something as simple as whether or not you like broccoli, something as profound as your religious belief system or your values like honesty, sincerity, hard work, compassion, something as transient as you're hungry or you're not hungry, right? That's where boundaries come from. They if you were to draw a person kind of who they are symbolically, the boundaries would be the edges of that person. There are some things that I have strong opinions about and some things I could go either way on. And that's true of all of us. So some of our boundaries are soft and loose and negotiable, like where we're going to eat dinner tonight or what movie we might watch. And some of those, and some days, even in those exact situations, some days can be really hard. Like I can't eat Italian food again tonight. I've had it 3 times this week. I can't do it. I'll eat somewhere else, or I'll fix myself something. Or I can't watch a sad movie tonight. Just not in that space. But you get to decide. You start to hear in my description of boundaries what it means to become human, to become a person. It comes as we know ourselves. That's this work. What do you need? What's okay with you? What's not okay with you? This I talk to parents about this. The idea is that this connection to your needs, as I've described earlier, becomes the new guiding moral North Star for your parenting. It becomes the source of your parenting decisions. I'm not comfortable with you playing with a knife. I'm only comfortable with you going out with in this situation, in these circumstances. I'm going to drug test you. Your driving privileges are related to X, Y, or Z. You get to decide. So when people go to AA, excuse me, when they go to Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous, they don't get directions about the template about how to be in relationship with a child who's struggling with substances. Kind of a checklist of things that if you do right, everything will be fixed. They start to get reconnected to self, to their boundaries. They start to attend and manage their own mental health. Distinguishing between healthy boundaries and selfishness, again, is difficult. In some sense, it's really none of your business. At least in a spiritual sense, I would invite you to abandon that. If your adult child says, I still want to use, you can have your boundary around that, whether you're supporting them or not, or whether they live in the home. That's your right and your boundaries. But in this sense, the way I'm talking tonight, you don't get to decide if they're an alcoholic or an addict. That's not your business. That's their side of the street. But that doesn't rob you. This is where people get confused because people say, well, if I set a tough boundary around substances, for example, around school refusal, if I set a tough boundary, I have to be right. And I have to make a case, not in the way that I'm talking about it. You don't. That's the opposite. That kind of living, that justification is kind of like a knife that has no handle. It's just a blade. It cuts the person that's using it. It doesn't work long term. And that's why in your own codependency recovery, the strongest position that you can take, and I've said this for decades now, is here's I might be wrong, I might be silly, I might be old fashioned, But here's my boundary. Here's my line. Here's my final decision. That is so much more solid grounding than this is what the University of Southern California just released in their research study. This is what the Harvard School of Medicine just released regard to addiction medicine. That's the weakest ground to stand on. It will feel wrong to us. I mean, that's if there's one thing that you take home from tonight, it's that healthy growth will feel wrong. That is why I won't answer questions about what you should do, because it has to come from you. And if you run a new behavior through an old brain, it gets all mixed up and confused. I can tell you what it might sound like if somebody had a healthy boundary, or if somebody was communicating assertively. I can tell you what it might sound like. I give examples of it, but those aren't recommendations. I just want you to start to hear the thinking that goes into it, the sensibility, the way of being that goes into it. Homeostasis is a principle in family systems theory, the theory that is the foundation of family therapy. Homeostasis is an energy where people try to get things to remain the status quo. Back to baseline, back to the way things were, back to the way that we've always done it. That's the essence of the betrayal in tonight's title. You are betraying old patterns. You're betraying your programming. You're betraying the original agreement that everybody had entered into. That's good. That's healthy. In mythological ways, that's where they talk about that there needs to be a death for a rebirth. The old needs to die for something new to be born. So remember that homeostatic energy will be present in relationships. So that's what we're betraying. Boundaries are what you feel comfortable. They arise out of your feelings, your thoughts, your wants, your hopes, your tolerances, your needs. Essentially, boundaries are synonymous with self-care. And I'm using the word synonymous intentionally. This is what I need in the role of a father. If I was at work, right? I had students in our wilderness program years ago say, I have $10,000 in my bank account. If you let me out of here or recommend that I come home, that $10,000 is yours. Right? And of course, I'm not going to do that. I'm not comfortable with that. That's really what being a self means. That's why I say, when people say you're not your child's friend, you're their parent, I know what they're trying to say. But in a deeper sense, being a friend and being a parent are similar in a lot of ways, maybe more ways than they are different. Because in a healthy friendship, you don't compromise and subjugate your own joy, your own meaning, your own peace of mind, just for the other person to be happy. People that say you're not your parent, you're not your child's friend, you're their parent. When they talk about that, sometimes I don't think they understand what a friend is. That a friend, I said this to somebody today. I'm just using this as an example. The Dalai Lama doesn't sacrifice his self-care. He relies on it. If he sacrifices his self-care, he knows that everybody around him is going to pay for it. And the people that he teaches are going to pay for it. And his compassion is going to be limited. It's going to fade. It's going to be shallow. So we take care of ourselves so that we can be more available to love. And that's a paradox. And I'll talk more about that. I love this quote from the drama The Gifted Child, talking about, excuse me, it's not from the drama The Gifted Child. I love this quote from The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. She's describing a scenario with a woman who's continuing to be asked more and more from from her aging father. And in the course of this continuing escalating asking, she's finding that her own life and her children, her family are paying for it, paying the cost. And when she comes to this realization that she needs to set a boundary with her father, she says, no matter how long I'm in therapy, I'm still going to feel guilty if I say no to my father. But if I keep saying yes, I'm going to feel angry. So if I'm going to change, I guess I will just have to learn to live with some guilt for a while. That paragraph changed my life. That paragraph is one of the, when I finally settled on and decided with the therapist that we train and evoke, I'm not going to have this silly discussion anymore about how guilt can be healthy, about how the big deal that guilt is different than shame. Shame is feeling bad for who you are, and guilt is feeling bad. I'm not going to be distracted by that. You will feel guilty for doing the right thing often. And that's because of your programming, because of your history. Harriet Lerner goes on to say many of our problems with anger occur when we choose having a relationship and having a self, right? That the dance of anger is about boundaries. It's about listening to our anger, our resentment as a signal that we need to take better care of ourselves. That's really, really important. Anger is effective. It's an effective tool in our lives when it causes us to be more clear about ourselves. But us codependents who struggle with boundaries, we go around feeling resentful of everybody in the way that they're treating us. And we say things like, you can't treat me that way. And I can't believe you would do that to me. I wouldn't do it to you. All of that energy can be retooled, right? It can be retooled into, I need to set a more clear boundary for myself. This is where I think this is an interesting model that I'm going to teach you. So in family systems theory was created in the 1970s in a few different places. In the late 1960s, 70s, people started to say, we're going to treat what goes on between people. We think we can have the biggest impact on people if we intervene at the relationships level instead of the individual level. And a whole field of study and practice came out of that, family and couples therapy. Prior to then, people were treated as individuals. Maybe they were treated in groups, but they were treated as individuals in groups, not spouses, siblings, parent, child. Okay. So there are a couple of different models that I'm going to draw upon. One is Murray Bowen in Washington, D.C., and the other one is Salvador Minuchin, was out of Philadelphia. And Minuchin was the first one to describe boundaries in this way. He said, on one end of a continuum, you have rigid boundaries. And with rigid boundaries, you cut off from people. You're reactive. You pull away. You avoid. On the other end of the continuum, you have diffuse boundaries. And people that employ this style or have this style tend to be enmeshed, overly dependent, overly reliant, reactive, and escalating fights, right? Arguments. And in the middle was some kind of balance, and he referred to them as clear boundaries or having a healthy relationship style. So one end is rigid and cut off, and one end is diffuse and enmeshed, and somewhere in the middle is that happy medium. Then Murray Bowen comes along. Interestingly, Murray Bowen was a teacher at a university working with psychiatry students, and he didn't work with families, but he saw people in the context of their family. So he would teach his the people that he supervised. He would supervise these psychiatrists and around therapy, and they would go home for breaks. They would go off for family vacations. They would come back and they would tell him stories. That was his treatment. That's how he developed the model, I should say. And he saw it a little bit different than Salvador Minuchin did. He created a scale from 0 to 100, a theoretical 0 to 100 scale. And he said at one end of the continuum is fusion and enmeshment. he called enmeshment fusion, right? If you're looking at me, my two fists clasped together, right? If my right hand moves, my left hand goes with it, and vice versa. Fusion and enmeshed. And then he said, and the other style that Mnuchin called cutoff, he said, is disengagement. Somebody who tends to pull away and disengage. But he said those aren't opposite ends of this continuum. The fusion and enmeshment style and the disengagement cutoff styles aren't on opposite ends of the continuum. They're at the 0 point of this scale, this continuum. At the other end of the continuum is what he called differentiation. So his point was, whether you are fused, whether you are enmeshed, or whether you react with that pulling away and avoidance and hiding, it doesn't really distinguish your level of psychological relationship development. It's just stylistically different. But this, it gets more and more interesting as I go. It gets more and more interesting. So you have this differentiation scale. And he talked about how if you grow up in a family, let's say you on a differentiation scale are this 0 to 100, you're a theoretical 65 on this balance between connection and autonomy. That's really what differentiation is. It's connection and autonomy and having a balance. He said, let's say you're 65. You look and relate to other people that are around 65. You are only attracted to people that are, and I'm making up these numbers, they're not precise. You're only attracted, you only get along with, you only relate to people that are somewhere between 60 and 70 if you're 65. As it starts to get higher on the scale, 75, 80, 85, 90, you don't relate to them. The people below you on the scale, 50, 40, 30, look immature, less evolved, more reactive. But the people above you, you have just as many judgments for. You think they are uncaring, that they're too stoic, that they're not really loving people. Because only 65 makes sense to you. So you go out in the world and you only connect to and gravitate to and hold on to people that are somewhere near you. So let's say a 63 finds a 67, that will make sense. But the cool thing is this. Yes, you think of 40s when you're 65, you think of 40s as immature. But if you start making progress, and by the way, it's slow moving. The pace of growth in this area is smooth. Excuse me, is slow. If you go from a 65 and you go to therapy and you've had some difficult trials in your life that have caused you to look deeper, to heal, to explore your trauma, to set new boundaries, to get more clear about yourself. And let's say you start moving up toward that 75, 80 number. The people that you were with who were around 65, you look crazy to them. You look like you don't care anymore. You'll be accused of abandoning them. You'll be accused of not loving them. You'll be accused of being self-righteous, arrogant, narcissistic, selfish. Because that's what it looks like when you're looking from below on the scale to higher on the scale. That's what your children will accuse you of. You don't care. You don't love me. Because they're used to you being in it with them, staying in the argument, staying in the fight, listening to them barrage you with arguments and debates and insults. I was describing this at one point to a group, and somebody asked me the question, if you do move up on the scale, if you move from a 65 to an 80 through a lot of hard work and time and courage, wouldn't it be beneficial to explain to the people that are left behind in the 65 range what's happened? And number one, they won't be able to see it, number one. But number two, most importantly, what I said is people, as they move up the scale, don't explain themselves to the people that are left behind. You wouldn't feel necessary to explain to, as a 65, you wouldn't feel obligated or feel like it makes sense to explain yourself to a 30, to somebody who still has the maturity of a child. The words coming out of your mouth would be babble to them. That's why moving up the scale is so difficult. It's lonely. You don't get support. People don't understand you. People don't support you. One thing also I love about this differentiation scale is I have the fantasy sometimes that I married somebody 20, when we get in a fight, when we're struggling, I fantasize that my wife is 20 or 30 pegs below me on the differentiation scale. We wouldn't have fallen in love. She wouldn't have made sense to me. I've shared this before. My wife identifies as having anxiety. So what that means is I fell in love with somebody who has anxiety. I have a lot of narcissistic traits. What that means is my wife fell in love with somebody who has narcissistic traits. I have other diagnosable issues also, right? That's what we have. And so it's a humbling thing. To a 65, 90s don't make sense just as much as 40s don't make sense. They seem just as off. And that's the loneliness of it. That's the betrayal. That's the 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 accusation that we have abandoned somebody in that situation is to some extent accurate. We have left them. If they're interested in it, if they feel and stick around long enough to get a taste of the joy and the peace that you're experiencing as you move up the scale, by the way, just a little bit, doesn't happen in big leaps and doesn't happen quickly. They might choose to come along too, to enter into therapy, to listen to a podcast, to listen to a self-help book that you found helpful. But if you're trying to drag them up, you haven't really moved up. If you're trying to guilt them up, you haven't really moved up. If you're trying to threaten them up, give them an ultimatum to get them to move up the scale, you haven't moved up. You're still in it with them. You're still enmeshed to that degree with them. You're still undifferentiated with them. I love this quote. This was in the journey of the audacity to be you, but I took it from a podcast. Invisibilia, July 1st, 2016, The Problem with the Solution, where a mother is heard to say to her child, "It breaks my heart to see him suffering. I'd do anything for him if it would help. There's nothing I wouldn't do for that boy," which sounds like and feels to the mother like love, but feels like to the boy like, "Stay away from me. You're smothering me." The lack of differentiation in that statement, the lack of boundaries in that statement feels to the child, feels to the other person like pressure, like anxiety, like intrusion, like control. This kind of comment I wrote, or even just that yearning oozes out of the person and works to trigger relapse in the person they're thinking about, which is odd and noteworthy because that kind of response sounds so supportive compared to hostility and criticism. They're feeling too closeted, too stifled. I wrote to go on. It's common to conflate love or loving too much with anxious attachment. Loving too much is a euphemism for the unhealed attachment wound and its expression in an anxious parent. The problem is not loving too much, but rather not enough self. Again, the foundation of intimacy, the foundation of healthy connection is selfhood, sovereignty of self, knowing yourself, being who you are, taking care of yourself. As Jung said, the unlived life of a parent is the greatest burden for a child to bear. This is why you're getting your needs met through them. Harriet Lerner talks in her book about preparing for that homeostatic energy, that change back. She calls it energy. Anticipate what your parent, what your child, what your sibling is going to say to you. Understand how it relates to your underdevelopment. If you're triggered by what they say, that's where your work lies. Sometimes, and I talk about this at the end, one of the assignments I give to people is identify your triggers. What would you hate to be called more than anything by your child? That's where your work is. That's the part you have to make peace with. Is it when they say you're being unfair? You're being unreasonable. You're not listening to me. You don't love me. Which, by the way, the great mystery of all of that is some of those things could be accurate feedback, but you have to know yourself well enough. If you can be pulled off of your center, if you can have that gravitational force field pull you off of your spot, off of your truth, off of your boundary, then you haven't come to know yourself well enough. You haven't made peace with yourself. What does it sound like when someone makes peace with themselves? It sounds like somebody calls me, let's say you don't care about me. It sounds like, I'm sorry. I get it. I'd feel the same way if I was you. It doesn't sound like arguing or debating or proving yourself, lying out the rationale and why you arrived at it, trying to convince them that you do still care or that you are fair or that you haven't abandoned them. All of those ideas, energies, tracks are evidence of a parent's undone work. And if they accuse you of something that's true, you accept it. Yes, I lashed out at you. Yes, I was trying to punish you. Yes, I was being unkind or judgmental. Yes, I was shaming you. Yes, I was guilting you. Yes, I was trying to use fear. I mean, that's what it sounds like. Hit and run, boundary setting doesn't work, she says. You'll be asked to do it over and over again. I know when I build up the courage and the strength and the clarity to set a clear boundary with somebody, and I do it, I feel this relief, and I don't want to have to do it tomorrow, but I'm going to. I'm going to have to do it again and again and again. It's a practice because things will naturally, like when you're digging a hole at the beach in sand, it fills back up. People go back to homeostasis, to status quo. Independence means, Harriet Lerner says, that we clearly define our own selves on emotionally important issues, but it does not mean emotional distance, but it will feel like it to the other person. A clear boundary where there has been none will feel to somebody else like you don't love them anymore, like you don't care. If you cared, you wouldn't set that boundary. If you cared, you'd give them some money, you'd give them a second chance. You'd forgive them and relax your boundary because that's the old way. That's the old paradigm. That's the old ways that your system operated in childhood and forward. In a story about a woman setting a new boundary with her mother, Dr. Harriet Lerner says, be prepared for the attack, withdrawal, threaten, or do her old thing. She calls these tests, right? This is what I mean by the child is the teacher, not the parent. And when you remember, when you learn, when you accept that the child is your teacher on the road to enlightenment and awareness, everything changes. You stop trying to change them. You stop making them the project to fix. And you start working on your own mental health as a daily practice. Like I said, identifying your triggers. What's the least thing you'd want to be accused of? Your child already knows it intuitively because it works. And when it works, they do it again. And when it doesn't work, they don't do it. So the buttons that they press in you are the ones that have been that have been not addressed by you. That have not been worked on by you. If they respond to your boundary with anger, punishment, and shame, it is validation that the boundary, and maybe even more, was necessary for your liberation and growth. The difference between a personality disorder and not is the demand. You have to pick me up. You have to help me with this. You have to let me live here. That is, in essence, the hallmark of a disordered personality versus I request, would you be willing to? If people punish you, if you're afraid to set boundaries with people in your life, part of that is your stuff and you've brought it to the table. And there also might be evidence that you know it's going to go poorly because you've tried in the past and you know exactly how it goes when you set boundaries with this person. But until you practice staying in relationship with your truth and expressing it to the people around you, you're part of the problem. and you haven't really given people the opportunity to sink or swim in terms of staying in a relationship with you. And it's hard. By the way, I just want to pause right here. It's hard. It's our life's work. And I don't care who you are and what book you've written on boundaries, let alone read. I don't care where you are on your recovery path, where you are on your therapeutic journey. It's hard. And we struggle. And old contexts cause regression. Going back home to the family, getting in relationship with somebody who has similar traits that your mother and father had, or your siblings had, or your teachers had, or your grandparents had, will cause regression to go backwards. That's why I love it when people ask during the Q&A. I said it last night emphatically. When someone says, I'm working on this, I'm working on it, I still slip back. I still go back to the old ways. Do you have any suggestions to accelerate my growth? And the point I made was, that's it. You want to know what health sounds like? It sounds like you being able to talk about your weaknesses. It sounds like you being able to talk about your anxiety, your disordered thinking. It sounds like you being in touch with your humanity, your humanness, and making it a part of the explicit conversations in your important relationships. I did this thing again. I'm sorry I reacted to you when you called the other day. I got scared, and when I do that thing I do. I failed again. I messed up again. That's what health and healing sounds like. It doesn't have all the answers and get polished up and perfect. It is somebody, like I've said, go listen to the Dalai Lama speak. A good percentage of a talk that he gives will be about his own foibles, his own humanity, his own mistakes, his own weaknesses. Differentiation, as I described earlier, equals a balance between connection and individuation, right? One doesn't rob the other. One doesn't ask the other to be sacrificed. So I get to be myself in this relationship, but I also practice accommodating and holding space for differences in you. If those differences are too core, if those differences are hurting me or just overwhelming me, I may have to pull back to figure myself out, to regroup, to settle my nervous system, or to set a boundary going forward. I love this quote from Amber Deslin. Secure attachment is the delicate tangle of feeling safe, interconnected, independent, and free. Secure attachment is the delicate tangle of feeling safe, interconnected, independent, and free. I love what James Hollis says about this. I love this quote. He said, the ultimate test of the family is not whether it provides safety and predictability, but whether or to what degree each person can leave it freely and return freely as a larger person. At some point, your children will become adults. And at some point, it will be important and imperative for them to figure out if being in relationship to you costs too much or not. If it's too expensive, psychologically speaking. My hope is that I will continue to grow and to learn so I earn the presence of my children, the presence of their company. That coming home, spending time with me will feel like a good thing, a safe thing where they can be themselves. And I've developed enough of a sense of self to allow and to see them to be who they are. Underneath all of that, of course, is maintaining the firm foundation of who I am and what I need. The ultimate test of a family, he says, is not whether it provides safety and predictability, but whether or to what degree each person can leave it freely and return freely as a larger person. I wrote in The Audacity to Be, recovery from codependency, as some suggest, is not about simply setting stricter boundaries. I think that's the first place that most people go. Recovery from codependency, as some suggest, is not about simply setting stricter boundaries. It's about setting better boundaries. Better boundaries refer to their quality, the intention and the idea behind the boundary. The boundary's purpose is to separate and distinguish people's emotional lives from one another so each can be connected in a healthier way. Recovery from codependency means different boundaries, and the difference is rooted in each person's differentiation and love. You see how this is more nuanced? And I'm sure that for some of you that might be new, I can imagine that some of it just sounds like psychobabble. But once you hear it, you'll see it everywhere. It will be in the music, the poetry, the art, the film, the books that you read, the stories that you listen to. It's everywhere. I love this great paradox between separateness, individuation, and connectedness. James Hollis wrote, so often the idea of individuation has been confused with self-indulgence or mere individualism. People will accuse you of that, for sure. But what individuation more often asks of us is the surrender of the ego's agenda of security and emotional reinforcement in favor of humbling service to the soul's intent. In other words, it's a very poetic way of saying when he talks about surrendering to the ego's agenda of security and emotional reinforcement in favor of humbling service to the soul's intent, ego is the part of us that needs to be right and good. The soul that he's referring to is not a ghost that lives inside of us. It's our most authentic self, our highest self, right? Our greatest values, our greatest gifts, our greatest knowledge, wisdom, and truth. So again, I think people imagine that individuation, that self-care, that boundaries, that saying no, that feeding your own joy is going to lead to this self-indulgence and hyper-individualism. But let me tell you where it ends. I love this quote. Somebody asked Ramana Maharishi, how should we treat others? And he responded, there are no others. The full circle, the full accomplishment of differentiation is a recognition that we're all connected, that we all are one, that when somebody else hurts it, it hurts us. That when we hear about some tragedy happening on the other side of the world, it hurts us because to an extent, it is happening to us, to our extended self. And that's what this looks like. It looks like enlightenment. It doesn't look like selfishness and hyper-individualism. It does it first, and it can get messy as the pendulum swings. I want to say a couple things about forgiveness. I'm actually going to save that to another broadcast. I'm just going to take you to the take-home slide. Part of what I've been talking about tonight is finding a new North Star. To do that, you have to tolerate guilt. It is not your conscience. Guilt is not your conscience speaking. It is the voice of your parents, of the other big people in your head, trying to get you to do what they think you should do. Others may not recognize or celebrate our new growth. There is some loneliness in our journey. We have to face our dragons, and they are ours. They may have been created from our context, from our parenting, from our programming, from our culture. But once they have found life inside of us, they're ours to fight. We have to learn to understand our own programming from our family of origin, how we were taught to feel responsible for other people's feelings. We teach others how to treat us, not by complaining or teaching or expressing our anger, but by our actions. That's where the loneliness comes in. We'll be accused of all sorts of heinous deeds and descriptions. Working on our boundaries will lead to a sense of empowerment, hope, and liberation. The individual who works on his or her boundaries will feel less depression, resentment, and anxiety. You have to learn to measure yourself less by how people respond. Yes, you listen and you consider it. But the more connected you become to self, the less somebody's reaction will pull you off of your center, away from your center. I like to say, do this for you, but if you won't do it for yourself, it's okay to start doing it for your child. At the end of Everything Everywhere All at Once, that's really what happened. The protagonist found her higher self in the context of trying to save her child. Everything Everywhere All at Once is about therapy and psychology and the thing that you parents are going through, who has a child that's struggling with mental illness or addiction. That's the story. That's the metaphor. You have to try new things and tolerate the anxiety of getting it wrong or being awkward. Go to meetings, if not therapy, if not a Finding You retreat, go to meetings where other people are talking about this. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap up for this evening. You can get your cameras out if you want to point them at the screen, and the respective web pages will pop up from the QR code. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, Finding You Intensive is that process. April 19th through 23rd. I cannot encourage it enough, too strongly. I myself have been to approximately 9 of them myself, not ours, but somebody else's. There's also an online option that is half the time and is a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. And it happens over a weekend. May 19th is the next offering. We also have Returning to You for anybody who's been to a Finding You or even a Returning to You and come back for a third time. October 11th through 15th is that next offering. And then we're going to do a Finding You weekend in the UK, about an hour and a half outside of London, June 23rd through 25th. I think there's one spot left, but it's going to fill long before June 23rd. We have custom Finding Connection for couples workshops and Finding Family workshops and intensives for families. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com or go to our website for more. We have support groups for current and alumni wilderness families. The next offering for that is March 30th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have a meeting for alumni of our wilderness program, parent alumni, just for alumni. March 28th at 6:30 p.m. is that next offering. And then we have a support group for intensives and coaching clients, April 11th at 6 p.m. April 11th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Sarah D, SARAD at evoketherapy.com or visit evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more information. If you want a coach who's trained in the model that I've been talking about and teaching about tonight, you can contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. One of our 40-something therapists can be, or coaches can be matched up for you to do coaching. It can be great for transitioning back home, for helping you with boundaries while your child is in the program, for helping you in any context, your couple relationships, parents, individuals, stage of life, anything. Coaching at evoketherapy.com. We invite all current families to try 6 12-step support groups, any combination of the following: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org is a great alternative, Buddhist-inspired recovery program. And the National Alliance on Mental Illness, you can go to NAMI.org and find out about free classes and resources in your local community. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast or my name, and it'll bring you to it. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there. You can also watch the rebroadcast of these live broadcasts on our YouTube channel. You can find Evoke Therapy programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. Or you can find the Evoke Intensive program on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has new content each week. Our 3 charitable partners, if you want to make a donation to help people that can't afford therapy, are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. These tax-deductible donations can also be earmarked for a certain population or for a specific program. My next broadcast, I'm going to be away next week on spring break vacation, will be April 3rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, where I will be taking your questions. You can always send questions in advance. You can invite family and friends of yours to the live broadcast. They can send in questions to webinar@evoketherapy.com, and I'll address those first as we start the live Q&A. All right, folks, I hope this was a helpful point of contact. I hope it's helpful in your progress and your process of learning. And for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up and being willing to look at yourself and do your own work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you when I get back from vacation. Take care. Bye-bye.